Welcome to Ideas in Action, a television series about ideas and their consequences. I'm Jim Glassman. It's no surprise that the economy is on the minds of most Americans. 1 in 10 of us is out of work. It's a rate that hasn't changed in a year and a half. So why aren't jobs being created? Why aren't businesses hiring? Can the government do anything about it? Should it? We've invited 3 different economists with very different views to tell us what they would do to get America back to work. Joining me to explore this topic are Heather Boushey, a senior economist at the Center for American Progress, where she focuses on job creation and employment. Kevin Hassett, senior fellow and director of economic policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute, and a former senior economist at the Federal Reserve. And Alan Tonelson, research fellow with the U.S. Business and Industry Council, a national business organization that represents nearly 2,000 domestic American companies. The topic this week, getting America back to work. This is Ideas in Action.
Funding for Ideas in Action is provided by Investors Business Daily. Every stock market cycle is led by America's never-ending stream of innovative new companies and inventions. Investors Business Daily helps investors find these new leaders as they emerge. More information is available at investors.com.
Nearly 15 million Americans who want a job can't find one, according to the Labor Department. About a third of those unemployed have been out of work for more than a year. And about 2.5 million more have given up looking for work altogether. An additional 9.5 million Americans work part-time but want to work full-time. During the recession, nearly 8 million jobs were lost, and many analysts say it will take years for the country to return to what we would consider a normal unemployment rate. So what can and should we do to spur job growth? Heather, officially, the recession is long over. Why haven't jobs increased?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I mean, first off, what does it mean that the recession is officially over? What that means is that our economy is no longer falling off a cliff. It's no longer getting worse. What that doesn't mean is that we're back to where we need to be. We've seen improvement, we've seen jobs being created, we've seen some economic growth, so we're sort of on that upswing, but we're still not back to where we want to be. One of the big reasons that we haven't seen jobs is because we haven't seen the growth in investment and the growth of firms going out there and seeing that economic demand and saying, hey, I need to hire some new people. That's what's going to create jobs. And we're not there yet. What we really need to see is more demand, more investment, then that's when we'll start to see jobs start to come back in our economy.
Kevin, you agree with that analysis?
Yeah, I think Heather pretty much nailed it. And in fact, I think that we need to stipulate up front, before we start talking about policy, that the experience that we're going through right now is very similar to the experience of every other country that's gone through a financial crisis, at least in recorded economic history. Typically, it's the case that even a decade after a financial crisis, the unemployment rate in the country that's been stricken is about double where it was before the crisis began. That means that 8 years from now, if we're typical for a country after a financial crisis, we're still going to have unemployment in the sort of 8% range. And I think that what we need to do in this show and other places is think about what are we going to do about that? How can we make it so that we, in fact, have a better experience than the typical country?
So you're saying this is a different kind of recession. It's not like the recession in the early 90s or even the one in 2000. This is caused by a financial crisis, and there's a lot of research now. Rogoff and Reinhardt wrote a famous book about this, so that we shouldn't expect to recover all that quickly.
Well, we could conceivably, but it's certainly not the base case. And we actually understand the linkage between the financial crisis and slow growth. The biggest thing is that the financial crisis is set off by too much credit. As credit contracts after the crisis, then it's a drag on the economy for a long, long time.
Credit meaning companies...
making loans to firms to buy machines.
I want to pursue this, and I'm going to get to each of you. But so what do you think the solution is? How can we create jobs now, or do we have to just sit around and wait for 10 years?
Well, I think that there are actually a number of solutions that we could pursue, and I'm looking forward to talking about these with the rest of the panelists. But I think that the main thought that I'd want to lead off the show with is this, that typically after a financial crisis, you have a decade where you grow about 1% a year less than you're used to. So that means in the U.S., we should be looking at 2.5% growth instead of 3.5% growth. And so what we need to do is we need to swing for the fences. We need to consider policies that could, on average, deliver something like 1% a year of growth for a long, long time, not something that would necessarily jack up growth just this year. A leading candidate, I believe, is fundamental tax reform. Alan Auerbach, who's a famous Democratic economist, and I wrote a book about fundamental tax reform a couple of years ago. We said that if we switched towards a consumption tax in the U.S., that you could gain about 1% a year growth over a decade. That's the kind of big change that we need to consider.
So Kevin says tax reform, which may mean cutting marginal tax rates, and other people say increasing government spending, but you don't think that either of those two is the right approach.
It's not so much that they're not the right approaches, it's that neither will be sufficient. And the reason has to do with the fact that this is indeed not your grandfather's recession. It's resulting from the fact that we had such a wild spending party in this country for so long, we face a massive deleveraging going forward, meaning we have to reduce our very high and very dangerous debt burdens. More important, we have to figure out how to grow while doing that at the same time, and that's extremely difficult. What it also means is that the standard relationships between tax cuts and investment increases and growth and employment have been greatly weakened, if not broken. And one big reason is that this economy today exists in a world economy that has permeated it with enormous volumes of exports of goods and services, so that often whatever tool we wind up choosing, when we stimulate spending, we no longer stimulate the same amount of growth and hence the same amount of employment that we used to.
Because we're importing?
The economy is much more open to imports.
So what is your big idea, or one of the big ideas to get things going?
The big idea, and I'm certainly not denigrating the need for tax reform, for more spending, especially on public infrastructure, which is in such tragic disrepair. But what is urgently needed in order to grow while cutting debts is substituting, on a very significant scale, what we make at home, goods and services, for what we presently import. And given the fact that consumers must retrench, and we should want them to, and given the fact that there's not a lot more government stimulus that's going to be provided for purely political reasons, that's about the only solid growth option we have left.
Heather, what do you think about that? What Alan's saying is make it harder to bring goods into the country to compete with American-made goods. What do you think about that?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, I do think it's interesting that Alan has pointed out that exports may be the only place where we can see an increase in demand coming from.
It's net exports.
Exactly, net exports.
It's the net.
You're saying we need to export more or import
relative
less.
To imports.
Right. Relative to imports.
Okay.
And that is a strategy. It's one we have to be sort of thinking about. I want to come back to that in a second, because I also want to touch on something that Kevin said, which is that, you know, it is true that we're coming in, that this is a recession that is the fallout of a financial crisis. And we know from the research that, yes, these tend to be deeper, more protracted. But I would caution us against having these lower expectations that we can't do anything about it. We've seen other countries deal with this slightly differently. Germany, for example, had a larger decline in output than we did here in the United States, but did not see the increase in unemployment that we saw, because they have different labor institutions and practices. So there are things that we could do to get folks back to work. For example, one of the most important things they have is they've allowed folks to cut their hours and get a short-term, a part-time benefit from the unemployment system in Germany, which then allows them to share the labor a little bit, so you don't see the high unemployment and especially the millions out of work that we've seen here in the United States.
Actually, I don't want to interrupt you there, but believe it or not, Kevin Hassett is in favor of that.
No, Heather and I know that. Yeah. We've talked about that.
But I think a lot of people would be surprised that you, working for a conservative
Sure, it's actually an interesting story that you know, those who know me know that I used to live in Germany and I speak German, and a friend of mine came to me at, believe it or not, his wedding. And he said to me, geez, the German unemployment rate isn't going up. What's going on with that? And so I started digging into it, calling friends in Berlin, and found a program that basically I think of as kind of fractional unemployment insurance. So right now, if the firm lays you off, then you get unemployment insurance, and the only way to get government to sort of play ball with helping a firm reduce costs is to lose the whole worker. And in Germany, they let you cut 5 guys 20%, and they each get 20% of their unemployment insurance is basically loosely what they do. And so then firms don't separate people from the workforce. And the reason why that's so important is that we see that when somebody's out of the workforce for more than a year, it's very hard for them to get back in. It's kind of like ground control to Major Tom. You know, they're not tied to the capsule and they're floating out to space, and they get very, very separated because they're discouraged and because firms will look at you and they'll say, well, Jim, you know, you haven't had a job for 2 years. You know, what's up with that? And they'll be nervous about hiring you.
Right, whereas you would have had 80% of a job. What do you think about that, Alan?
Well, what's also very critical to remember about Germany's experience is that to a great extent, Germany has exported its way out. In fact, Germany's global trade surplus is about 20% higher year on year between 2009 and 2010. So Germany, which was a country that many respected observers like Martin Wolf from the Financial Times has accused of exporting too much, saving too much, not consuming enough, they have extricated themselves from a very deep hole, absolutely, by exporting their way out, by doing more of what they had been already doing.
But isn't that kind of cultural? I mean, you know, the United States is just not an exporting country. I mean, it's exporting more than it used to. It's exporting a lot in the services economy. We just did a show on that. But really, Americans have never been focused that much on exports.
Well, I think in one sense you're right. That, I mean, we used to be a country that exported a lot more, but we're also a country that is not sort of taking the time to focus on that as an economic strategy and sort of thought through what does that mean to be making stuff that we're going to send out around the world. But I think there's a very important thing. I mean, services are great to export. That's one issue, but you don't get the kind of positive externalities, to use an econ term, when you have services that you do with manufacturing. With manufacturing, you have the technical innovation, but you also have, you have all sort of the high-tech stuff, but then if you have the actual sort of commercialization making it, you can create millions of good jobs here in the United States if you focus on a strategy that encourages that kinds of economic development.
What kind of jobs do you think Americans can expect to see increase over the next 10 years?
Well, we know what has been projected to increase over the next 10 years. Those are a lot of jobs in services. Most of them don't require higher education. They also tend to be jobs in many of the caring sectors, home health aides, child care workers, these kinds of jobs. And interestingly, these jobs are also currently vastly disproportionately on average jobs that are held by women. So those have been the growth areas for quite some time now and are projected to be sort of moving on into the future. Now, I mean, clearly the recession changes to some degree, you know, how we think about that path, and what we do moving forward may change that. But I think that those jobs, I think we will continue to see an increase in.
But Heather, isn't it true when you look at the unemployment figures by education level, you find that unemployment is actually quite low among people that have college degrees and higher, and people who have less education, they're the ones who are suffering the most. So doesn't it make sense that there will be more jobs created at the higher education levels?
Well, that's not actually what we've seen. I mean, and that's not actually what's projected. But I think that it is typically the case that the more education you have, the less unemployment folks see. But these jobs at sort of the lower end of the spectrum, are the ones that have been more subject to layoffs. You've seen, higher job losses. You see sort of more job turnover. I think that's, those are some of the keys there. But I don't know that it is that. Yeah.
I want to get to one obvious point that our viewers are kind of wondering about, most likely, spending. I mean, what about government spending? We had a stimulus plan, which some people think worked, some people think didn't work. But at any rate, there is sentiment, certainly in this country, for more government spending. Can't government create jobs by spending money?
I think there's a couple of things that government can and should continue to do. First off, in the Recovery Act, we poured a lot of smart money, and actually before the recovery, during the last year of the Bush administration, into the unemployment insurance system. One of the most important things we can do to keep people with a little money in their pocket when they're out of work, but also keep money flowing through our economic system.
But 99 weeks of unemployment, isn't there a point at which people begin to say, well, hold it, I'm getting paid. I'm getting paid not to work, plus I can probably find a part-time job on the black market and not have to pay taxes. I know lots of stories like this.
Well, I think there's two things there. Number one, what's going to happen at the, or what we're looking at is not the folks, there is this issue of folks getting 99 weeks, but there's also the folks needing 27 weeks of benefits. And that's something that requires continued action by Congress to make sure that folks are getting those benefits after they've been employed for at least 6 months. And that is where we need to be very concerned. Granted, once somebody's been out of work, as Kevin said, for a year or two, they're disattached from the labor market, they're losing skills. We need to be focusing on what to do about those long-term unemployed.
Okay, but besides unemployment insurance,
yes,
which I think most Americans think is a good idea, what about, these big public spending projects? Alan mentions infrastructure.
I think that was going to be my second point. I think that is exactly where we should be focusing our government dollars right now for a couple reasons. Number one, interest rates are at historic lows, construction costs are low, we got lots of unemployed people. This is the best time for government to go out and spend its dollars effectively on infrastructure. Second reason, as Alan pointed out, our infrastructure is in disarray. We've got bridges falling down, we've got roads in disrepair. Now is the time to move our economy into the 21st century. This helps small American businesses transport their goods. It helps us get to work. Now is the time to do it. But then third, the other thing we're seeing is that the private sector just isn't investing right now. They are not making the kinds of investments that we need to see. A lot of economists, when the economy's booming, you don't want government to be investing too much because it would crowd out private sector investment. That is the least of our worries right now. What we're trying to do is actually create the confidence of the private sector that America is sort of on an upswing and that we're going to have the infrastructure to make that happen. I
want to see what Kevin thinks about that.
Right. Well,
about more government spending, private sector's not spending anyway.
So first on infrastructure, it's correct that the infrastructure is a mess. The American Society of Civil Engineers gives it a D. So there's a lot of stuff to do out there, and we're not doing it because when we allocate highway funds or stimulus funds to do something, we tend to build a new highway in honor of somebody's wife or something, and so we need to be much smarter.
Fun.
It's more fun for the congressman.
Photo ops.
Yeah, that's right. But
it's just a generally inefficient system.
Right.
Okay,
but I was just going to say that I think that the reason why, a main reason why people aren't investing right now is exactly what Milton Friedman used to write about. That people look at $1.5 trillion deficits and they think, geez, they're going to have to tax me to get that money. And so why should I really load up on new investments going into the future when the U.S. is the second highest corporate tax place on earth? It's about to be the highest because Japan is finally lowering their corporate rate. And we've got these massive deficits that are going to have to be funded by taxes. I have a friend who told me that he did a calculation where he said, if U.S. firms pay the typical share of the current deficit going forward, the present value of it, that they've paid in taxes in the past, then most of them would have a negative book value because of that high liability. And so in that kind of a state, then if we get too aggressive about trying to fix the roads and so on, then we're not going to resolve the uncertainty about how we're going to fix this deficit. And so I think what we need to do is, while we're having a tax reform, we need to recognize that government spending has to come down, revenues probably have to go up, and we have to create a kind of a certain climate so that people have the confidence to invest again.
So it's sort of a catch-22, that if government spends a lot of money, the private sector's not spending, but if government spends it, people, you mentioned Milton Friedman, people understand intuitively
that they're going to
have to pay for that through taxes, and so they're less likely to invest.
Yeah, and especially when
so you're kind of stuck. I mean, there's really not much you can do. You're saying the answer is actually to cut government spending.
I think that we're ready. We're past the point where we need a quarter or two of really high government spending to keep us from falling off a cliff, and we're at the point where we need to try to fix things that are broken so that we can look ahead for a decade, not just for a year, and say, oh, okay, I can be confident again.
And you're skeptical about government spending as well?
I'm skeptical about government spending in the abstract. I'm certainly strongly in favor of more government infrastructure spending because, again, the needs today are so great. Every time I drive to work, it's like a life-threatening activity.
You're saying, well, we need to fix the bridges anyway, even if we didn't have this problem.
But there are added benefits. For example, most construction materials are made here still. It's changing slightly, but it's still largely true. Much of the steel that is used in roads and bridges, etc., is made here. Not enough of it, and there should be more, but that creates a tremendous multiplier effect too, plus the jobs not only from installing this stuff, but from actually making it. But the problem with this uncertainty argument is that, and I can tell you, I work with nearly 2,000 companies. They're mainly small and medium-sized companies. They're very entrepreneurial. They love to make money, and they hate the government. And they hate the health care plan, okay? They are terribly worried that they're exactly going to have to pay for that health care plan. But the main reason they cite to me for not buying this or that new piece of machinery or adding on to the factory and hiring new workers is they don't have enough orders. And they see no prospect of a significant number of orders coming on stream.
Maybe I should ask Heather this question. You know, there are parts of the rest of the world that are doing really, really well. I mean, you know, the Chinese are growing at 8%. The Brazilians are growing, I don't know, 6%. The Indians are growing at 8%. And the United States can sell things to the Indians, to the Brazilians, to these countries that are doing well. So they may not have the orders in the United States, which is obviously we've got some problems. But if you buy Alan's argument and we kind of shut down our own borders, then other countries are going to shut down theirs. I mean, how do you feel about this whole trade solution?
Well, I think that the key here is that we need customers here in the United States. I mean, we need to sort of create...
Sure, but it's a big world. I mean, the United States is 300 million people. The world is 6 billion people. Why do we have this fetish about just selling to Americans?
Well, I think you need...
I'll let Alan answer.
Yeah, Alan's
too.
like...
I know, but why don't you... But you should... Why don't you answer the question and we'll go to Alan?
I think you need to do both. I mean, certainly, I think you need to focus on, what can policymakers do to encourage U.S. exports? What can we do to make sure that we're creating the kinds of things that we can export? And what kinds of foreign policy and dollar policy are we pursuing that makes our exports competitive overseas? And I think all of those are things that, folks here in Washington are talking about, and I think that's certainly a place to think about. But there's also this question of, here in the United States, because you aren't creating the kinds of jobs here at home, you're not creating the demand here at home for the goods and services that creates the incentive for firms, especially the small and medium-sized firms, for whom there may be a large, they may be focusing domestically.
Okay, we're getting back to the main question, which is, how do you create jobs? I mean, where do they come from? Can you create jobs without having decent economic growth? I mean, Heather started off by talking about how, well, the recession may be over, but we're still not growing very much. Well, you know what? We actually are growing. I mean, we're growing 2 or 3%. I mean, we're growing a little bit.
Well, we're growing
Why aren't we creating jobs?
1.7% rate lately.
Yeah, it's not very much.
1.7% real after trillions of dollars of stimulus.
Year on year, I think I'm not happy with it either.
That's the annual
but
rate.
We are growing. We're not in a recession. Well, why aren't we creating jobs? How do we create jobs?
Circle back again, because it's one of those moments where, at least on economics, Heather and I don't always agree. But on this one, it's very maddening that Washington hasn't stepped up and copied the Germans a little bit. And I just want to put it in perspective. The government can't create jobs, okay? The private sector is really, they can give people jobs, but mostly the private sector is the engine of job growth. And the private sector is doing it. It's creating, 4 million jobs a month and destroying 4 million jobs a month, and so the net is about zero.
Right. This is a very important point. Can you just put a finer point on this?
Yeah.
I don't think most people understand
and so when you see that we created 100,000 jobs last month, then it's not because everybody stayed in place and then there was 100,000 new jobs because they built a building over there. What happened was that if we created 100,000 jobs in a typical month, maybe 4 million jobs were created, new jobs, because they put in a new donut shop in your town and so on, and 3.9 million jobs were destroyed because some factory cut back or again the donut shop closed. And so the net number of 100,000 is the sort of job creation number that matters for unemployment, because there's people sitting unemployed and it's the net number that gets them employed.
Right.
We can drive the net number up by slowing job destruction because the underlying flows are so enormous. There's millions and millions of jobs being created and destroyed every month. Government shouldn't think, okay, I'm going to go out and create jobs, because the government isn't really going to do that. But the government can change its policies so that job destruction is slowed. If you could cut job destruction by about 10%, with a work-sharing program like the Germans have, and I think that's a reasonable expectation of what you might be able to accomplish. That's 400,000 jobs a month. That would be 5 million jobs in a year, and that's not the whole problem, but it's a big step forward.
Yeah, Heather.
And I think that this is the right time for that policy.
Right.
We've seen millions of jobs destroyed during this recession. I think some folks were sort of thinking, oh, this is going to be over. We're not going to really need to think through this policy. But now is the right time. We're seeing the growth in the labor market slowing. We're seeing sort of this challenge. So I just want to underscore that I think this is the right time.
Let me be sure I understand this policy. I mean, a lot of people kind of made fun of the French when they said, well, nobody can work more than 40 hours. They're only going to work 35 hours, and that way we're going to create jobs. I thought that was called the lump of labor fallacy back when I went to when I was studying economics. I mean, how is it that you can cut the amount of time that people work, and yet
can I answer that? Because I was just going to say that it's much different because we're not telling them they have to do it.
Right.
And so what's happening is that there's always some guys creating jobs, some guys destroying jobs. And right now, government policy tells the people who are destroying jobs, well, you've got two choices. One is that you can lay somebody off, in which case the government will help make it not so bad for them. And of course, firms want to do that. They like their workers typically. He says, or you could reduce people's hours a little bit, in which case the government's not going to help.
I see. So they really have a choice. Either kind of fractional unemployment, or the
government policy is biased
the,
towards the wrong answer right now, and we need to fix that.
The right answer is
we should note that there are, there's 17 states that allow firms to do this, but we could be doing a lot more to get the other states to do it. We could be doing a lot more to make it easier for states, for employers in these states to apply for these programs, to get this short-term compensation. So there's a lot that policymakers could do on this.
Heather, unfortunately, we're going to have to stop you right there. We've run out of time. But we'll continue our conversation on how to get Americans back to work on our next program. And before we go, I want to remind viewers that you can catch Ideas in Action whenever and wherever you choose. To watch complete shows, just go to our website, ideasinactiontv.com, or download a podcast from the iTunes Store. And that's it for this week's Ideas in Action. I'm Jim Glassman. Thanks for watching.
For more information, visit us at ideasinactiontv.com. Funding for Ideas in Action is provided by Investors Business Daily. Every stock market cycle is led by America's never-ending stream of innovative new companies and inventions. Investors Business Daily helps investors find these new leaders as they emerge. More information is available at investors.com. This program is a production of Grace Creek Media and the George W. Bush Institute, which are solely responsible for its content.